Well, to the MTTV studios for Greg Jones, one of our guests who talk on things finance. And we have obviously brought you in here to talk about the budget. And you've heard it, you've seen it. What do you think?
No great surprises. I don't think any of us were expecting surprises. Certainly I wasn't. Limited scope for taking radical steps. Well, within what is politically or economically feasible, you'd have said limited scope for taking radical steps on either the taxation side or the spending side. Come back to spending in a minute. I have to say that the only thing that surprised me as far as tax measures were concerned was the proposal to make people who are tax capped commit to paying the tax capped amount for 5 years.
I'm guessing there's been some examples of people dipping and diving in and out as and when they want. I presume that's what this is about, though, isn't it?
I think that's what this is about, yes. And this all stems from the fact that the Isle of Man general rate of company income tax is 0%. And because of pressures from the EU, we've had to kind of withdraw what you might have said were the anti-avoidance measures that would otherwise have prevented Isle of Man resident individuals from exploiting or abusing the 0% company income tax rate. So I suppose you might have had situations, for example, of somebody receiving his earnings in a company. The company pays tax at 0%. The individual takes out minimal drawings or salary, and so the total tax between the two is very little. And then maybe after 5 or 6 years, the individual takes out a large dividend, maybe to pay off some loans that have arisen in the meantime, and only takes one tax hit, the liability cap of £120,000. And you can see how the government might have regarded that.
You'd call that tax planning, though, wouldn't you?
As an abuse. As a professional, you'd have to say if the opportunity was there and a client asks you about it, you'd be failing in your duties if you didn't point that out. But equally, it has to be said, when the tax cap was introduced all those years ago, it was intended to attract high net worth individuals to the island. And these were people who might be prepared to make a sustained economic commitment to the Isle of Man, and it wasn't intended to give locals who happen to be quite wealthy a tax break. So you might say that all's fair in love and war where that's concerned, and I have to say probably there won't be too many tears shed for the few individuals who were going to be affected by it. They themselves will obviously be fairly disgruntled, I'd have thought, but it's probably a reasonable measure.
Well, it's 5 years now, you've got to sign into it. I mean, Mr. Tier was saying to us in our press briefing that other countries are all doing the same thing now. So even here, there's a lot of competition for these high earners, aren't there? High wealth earners.
Well, yes. I mean, that's why I think the tax cap per se has to be sacrosanct up to a point. And I think the government's made no secret of the fact that the tax cap is a valuable tool in its strategy for attracting and retaining high net worth individuals. And yes, you're absolutely right. You look around the world, you can find lots of very sunny places actually. In Europe, where I'm thinking about places like Monaco, where the personal tax rate is very, very low. Well, it's zero. Of course, it costs you a lot to live there, and you have to weigh up the cost of living and other aspects of living in a jurisdiction with the amount of tax that you would save. The Isle of Man's pretty well positioned, but there is a lot of competition. Gibraltar, for example, you can live as what we call a Category 2 resident and pay a maximum of about £30,000 tax a year. And again, a lot of sunshine down there.
Is the Isle of Man, though, still a good place to come to do business with? I mean, this is what you're here for, your company. I mean, do you sell it? Do you need to sell it, or do people come to you? Or?
Well, you've actually hit the nail on the head in terms of a very important matter that hasn't attracted a lot of publicity with all this budget furore, and that is making the Isle of Man an easy place to get to. Now, to an extent, the Isle of Man does sell itself. We've created a sound economic and regulatory infrastructure. Low taxes speak for themselves, and we can't do much about the climate, but the culture and the general infrastructure is very British, and so obviously the Isle of Man has a lot to commend itself. But I think that we have to do something about, I'll be quite specific, air links. We have to nail down the future of the air links to and from the Isle of Man.
We've got 3 going to be with BA again coming up, so that's good news, isn't it?
Yes, it's very good news, but you and I have probably been around long enough to know that it's also parlous. We don't know whoever's going to be here this year, we don't know whether they're going to be there next year. And there may be something to be said. It would be quite a considerable investment, I know, for the government to commission a working party, look at making a significant long-term investment into the air links that serve the Isle of Man, to make us not only an easy place to leave, but also to come to, both for business travellers and for personal travellers, because it is quite a big issue, and it doesn't seem to be reducing in its intensity. If you make the Isle of Man an easy place to come to, and if people can be confident of long-term sustainable air links, I think that will be a big tick in the box, certainly as far as business confidence is concerned.
I think Mr. Tier hasn't taxed the smaller aircraft, the 19-seaters. I mean, when the UK brought in the tax, because at one stage they were both exempt, weren't they? Mr. Tier did not bring in the tax from the Isle of Man outwards. He's done his bit, maybe he'll say, for the smaller aircraft, but you know, communications, you're still saying, is quite a big thing. People actually physically need to get on and off on, whenever they want, basically.
It's when any group of travellers gets together, it's the thing they whinge about the most. And often it's unfair, because I have to say, speaking personally as a frequent flyer, the number of times I've been seriously let down compared with the number of times where everything goes like clockwork is relatively limited. But when things do go wrong, they go wrong in a big way, and usually that's not the airline's fault, but that's no consolation to you as a traveller. And it's just this not knowing how long a particular route is going to be in existence with a particular airline at a particular price, etc. And I just wonder if there isn't something to be said for trying to make the future more secure. I don't know, commission a working party, bring in Sir Michael O'Leary, he doesn't need the money, he doesn't need the kudos, but who knows? I think we need to get some experience on board, as it were.
Back to the budget.
Back to the budget.
Things you would like to have seen that weren't there, for instance? Anything you'd be surprised?
Well, we talked about taxation, and there isn't probably a great deal more to say about taxation, in addition to the tax cap being sacrosanct. I think the government's long regarded the 0-10 corporate regime as being sacrosanct, so fortunately nothing was done. You remember a year ago we extended the 10% rate to cover retailers who earned over a certain threshold, so that's all done and dusted.
And none of them have disappeared, have
they? No.
There's a lot of worry that might be it. But.
So fortunately that seems to have settled down. He has introduced personal allowances by a small amount, and that's good news because they've been static for a number of years, and it will go some way towards paying off the toilet tax, it has to be said. We're probably not going to talk any more about the toilet tax.
Others can do that.
Yeah. So the tax side, I think the scope was limited, and that showed. On the spending side, again, it depends how radical you really want it to be. The Treasury Minister made the point that the government was committed to reducing headcount, overall expenditure by a certain amount over a certain period, and we seem to be on track to achieve that if the statistics do add up. These are positive steps. They're quite small steps, but they're positive steps and seem to suggest we're heading in the right direction. I mean, obviously, you've got to take the thing in the round. I mean, on the one hand, we're reducing the number of government departments from 9 to 7, and you have to say that's got to be good news in terms of creating economies of scale. That's slightly offset by the fact that the overall expenditure on the Cabinet Office is going to increase from 13 million to 26 million. Well, that's doubling. So you do have to see these things in the round, but equally I think you've got to see them over a long-term period. You've got to look at the cumulative effect of taking all these small steps. And the scope is otherwise limited unless you want to be radical and look at, for example, the future of the benefits regime in the Isle of Man. Now, that is very much on the agenda. That was hinted at yesterday by Mr. Tier, and that could give us the scope to take far more radical steps than simply, tinkering at the edges. Because if you can link up the availability of benefits and public services to the people who most need them, then you may reduce this. You may take out a significant cost element. We, I think, have far too long tried to present ourselves as a mini Britain. In terms of the social services and benefits regime we have to offer. We're not a mini Britain in terms of our system of taxation and our general infrastructure. The profile, the demographics, etc. of the Isle of Man are quite different from the UK. We rely a lot on financial services, etc., etc. And so you have to say that if we're going to continue as a low tax jurisdiction, we do really need to see what kind of overall public and social services regime we can support, and that means not take it away but try and focus it, target it more much more smartly on those areas of the population that really need them.
And of course, the Manx pensioners, their Christmas bonus has been halved. I mean, that was one of the headlines, from 80 down to about 40 odd pounds. But as you say, it's a tricky one, isn't it, when you're in a low tax environment to give all these.
You have to look at the overall package, see what it costs, and try and be a little more focused. For example, people in the professional sector, you've got to say, do they need to be able to get their prescriptions cheaply? Do they need to be able to wander in to see a doctor and not pay for that at all? Childcare has already been reduced, but maybe the scope for reducing that even further. I think we've got to be a lot more focused as to who needs and deserves benefits and who should be relying on public services and who shouldn't. I mean, you talk about pensions, the other sort of long-term cloud on the horizon, which the government has started to do something about, but looking at the Pink Book yesterday, it's still very much a long-term cloud on the horizon. That's public sector pensions. And if you look at the cover provided by the Pension Reserve Fund, it's reducing from 8.5% to 7.5%. If that carries on reducing at that rate, you don't need to be a mathematical genius to work out that's going to disappear altogether.
There's all these stories about people getting these last hikes in their last few years and going off on more, but that's for another day. Back to what I'm saying, just about you and your clients and the Isle of Man PLC. Good or bad, and how do you rate any tier on that budget? Give them a number out of 10, please, to finish with.
Well, I think the measures that the government has introduced are probably as expected, and whether in the ideal world you'd expect them to go further, again, you've got to look at it in the context of what's economically and politically feasible. The PR, the communications aspect, again, I think the government's handled that pretty well. So notwithstanding the fact there are lots of things that we would rather see happen in the long term, I think to date, normally when you put me on the spot, I come out around about 7.5. I'm not going to deviate from that this time.